Chapter 14. Nervous didn't even begin to describe it. No, all-out terror came much, much closer, until Jeff stood in front of his mirror on Saturday evening, adjusting and then readjusting the black bow tie at his neck. He had never really put into words why he had begged off the prom, the harvest festival, his cousin's wedding, the sweetheart dance. Now he had the words, thousands of them jamming through his head. They had to do with a certainty that this night could end in no good way, and how foolish she was to think otherwise. They had to do with the fact that he had 2 left feet that couldn't communicate with each other enough to even fake dancing. And they had to do with the fact that somehow something was bound to go wrong and smash any chances he had of this relationship going forward. Okay, so it had been on all but pause for the last 4 days anyway, but until that moment, he had succeeded in convincing himself that that was because of work. His work, her work, work. Not the tremulous way they had left things when he had walked away from her door the Saturday before with barely a kiss. She was angry, hurt, he knew that, but still his best instincts said that she didn't really want to know. She thought she did, but she really didn't. With a frustrated sigh over the perpetual tilt of his tie, as well as the perpetually negative track of his thought processes, he shook his head and stepped away from the mirror. Good enough was going to have to be good enough. There was no more he could do. One set of fingers wound over the black satin bodice ensnaring Lisa's chest. She pulled upward, knowing the motion was pointless, but trying anyway. This dress had been in her closet for 3 years, ever since the last fiasco of the formal dinner party she had been invited to. She remembered buying it at the behest of Haley, who had thought she looked just gorgeous in it. The only problem was, gorgeous had nothing to do with comfort. Even pressed business suits cinching in all the wrong places were more comfortable. At least those she couldn't fall out of. True, the dress sported a sequin jacket that did a passing job of concealing most of the strapless top, but that didn't make it any more comfortable. All week she had thought about going to get something else, something other than this nightmare. However, in the back of her mind, she had thought this moment would never really arrive anyway, that he would talk himself out of it, that she would come to her senses and call off tonight, that the whole idea would simply blow over. Instead, it blew right to her doorstep. The knock, soft yet undeniably there, sounded, and she took a treacherous breath in as she yanked the jacket on. She hadn't seen him since Saturday, and over the course of the week, tucked neatly behind her stacks of work, she had tried repeatedly to convince herself that he wasn't as wonderful as she had originally thought he was. No, he couldn't be as handsome or as sweet or as thoughtful or as... The nanosecond after she opened the door, however, those thoughts splintered into 100 million non-discernible letters, for standing there, on the other side of her threshold, gaze down, he looked more incredible than any human being had a right to. Muscles concealed by the black material spread across his shoulders, strong, even hiding beneath propriety. As she fought to catch her breath from the sight of him, his gaze bounced sheepishly to the wall, and then up to hers as the pink rose in his hand trembled. "Hi," he said when his gaze caught hers, although the syllable floated just beneath the air. A smile, gentle and soft, drifted over her as all her doubts receded. "Hi." Traveling a half-inch at a time, he held the rose out to her as his gaze bounced to the floor and then back up to hers. "For you." "Thanks," she said, mesmerized by the denim blue of his eyes. The white shirt made the depths of them seem positively endless. Come on in." As he followed her forward, he looked at his watch hesitantly. "I'm a little early." "I'm not complaining." She smiled as she set the rose in a glass in the kitchen. "Let me just grab my purse and we can get going." He nodded, although she noticed how stiffly he stood, how formally, how awkwardly, and she wondered if that was because of the tuxedo, the night, or something else. With one more check in the hall mirror, she arched her shoulders backward and walked out to meet him. Shall we? That lopsided, shy smile sent her senses reeling away from her. We shall. Every moment was fraught with possible perils. At the car, it was the second he opened the door and her dress didn't get all the way in. Should he say something? Help it in himself? Then she reached down and pulled it in, and relief flooded through him. Making conversation in the car was equally risky. He didn't want to say anything to remind her of their last conversation if she had indeed forgotten. Yet what do you talk about when even work is a dangerous subject? He settled on cars. His car. This car. It was a relatively safe topic, although not very interesting. She didn't seem to mind, and he had to admit, even though he was one push from going over the edge, that he liked how perfectly she fit in the passenger seat, no matter what they happened to be talking about. At the hotel, his nerves kicked into overdrive, so much so that when the lady at the sign-in table asked for his name, his memory lapsed just long enough for Lisa to have to take his arm and save him. Jeff Taylor and Lisa Matheson, she said confidently, and his breath snagged on the sound of her voice. Ah, here it is, the lady said with a smile. She checked their names off. Have a nice time. Thanks, Lisa said with no trouble at all. Gently, she laced her arm through his and steered him away from the table. They walked in slow lockstep across the gathering. Are Dustin and Eve coming? He mentioned it, but I'm not sure, Jeff said, crawling carefully back to the surface of life. He looked at her, but that did nothing more than tie his tongue as tight as the bow at his neck. Somehow, he had to calm the rush of anxiety flowing through him before he completely humiliated himself. Hey, isn't that Dante? Lisa asked, pointing across the room. Jeff glanced over to where she was pointing. Yeah. Quick, hide me, she said, sliding around and ducking behind him. He arched an eyebrow at her. You don't like Dante? He might ask me to dance, she said, and Jeff wasn't sure how much of the fear was pretend and how much was real. Well, at least he won't ask me to. The smile in her eyes when she looked at him lifted his spirits. Now that would be scary. So you made it after all, Hunter said from behind Jeff, and simultaneously he and Lisa turned. In one piece and everything, Jeff said, extending his hand. Lisa, Hunter said, nodding to her. It's nice to see you again. She nodded at him. Well, have fun, you two, he said, and turned back to cross the dance floor. The second he was gone, Jeff breathed an audible sigh of relief. What? Lisa asked as she stepped up to the food table. With him around, I never quite know what to expect. Why not? Cornflakes in my bed, flour in my locker. He's a regular laugh-a-minute. As she slowly filled her plate, Lisa looked over at him, and her face scrunched. Cornflakes? Maybe you should have applied for hazard pay. With Dante and Hunter, that was a definite possibility. He put a radish on his plate and 3 carrots. I wonder if Hayes is going to be here tonight. She licked the dressing that had gotten a little carried away off her finger. If he sees me, he'll probably run for the exits. Jeff stole a glance down the side of the black satin that streamed to the ground. Not looking like that, he won't. Her eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Mischievously, he leaned closer to her. It means, I don't think I told you how gorgeous you look tonight. The statement brought her gaze to his, and sincerity flooded through him. What a horrible oversight on my part. For one glorious moment, the world around them ceased to exist, and for him, living in that moment forever would have been more than enough. Taylor? The voice asked behind him, and reluctantly, Jeff turned to it and found Craig and Bridget standing, plates in hand, at the edge of the carpet. Craig, hey man. Jeff transferred his plate to the other hand so he could extend one to Craig. It's been a while. We were just going to find a place, Bridget said. Want to join us? Lead on. Jeff picked up a glass of tea from the end of the table. The foursome wound their way around to the tables and picked one midway from the back. So, I guess the fact that you're here means you actually found a job, Craig said when they were seated. Downtown, Jeff said, nodding. You? Galena Park. How are the kids? Jeff asked as he set the napkin on his knee, willing it to be kind and stay there. Growing, Bridget said in exasperation. Carrie starts school in August. Ugh, that doesn't even seem possible. Jeff picked up his fork. Then he realized Lisa was being left out of the conversation, and he leaned over to her as he cut into the salad. Carrie was the cutest little kid, all blonde curls. She was fascinated with the pump controls. Man, she could sit up there for hours on that thing, playing supervisor. Bridget laughed. She hasn't grown out of that one, either. So, have you heard from Ramsey? Craig asked. No, we've been down to see Dustin and Eve a couple times, but haven't heard from Ramsey. Oh, how are they doing? Bridget asked. Good, Jeff said, nodding. They might be here tonight. Well, speak of the devil, Craig said, as his attention snapped up behind Jeff, who turned to see their conversation topics approach the table. Well, what have we here? Dustin asked, sounding far less melancholy than he had the previous weekend. I didn't know you guys cleaned up so good. Yeah, and I didn't know you had such good eyesight either, Craig taunted back. Have a seat. I believe we will. The evening, so similar and yet so very different from the first time Lisa had shared a table with these people, seemed to stream by on fast forward. Conversation and laughter flowed from every quarter until it occurred to her that this was easily the most fun she had ever had. At 9, the band started playing, and someone turned down the lights so that their little table, which had been at least partially lit, was now all but black. I do believe it's time to dance, Dustin said, turning to Eve formally. Mrs. Knox? Eve smiled at him, and Lisa smiled at them. There was nothing but love in the look they exchanged. Slowly, Eve stood and accepted Dustin's hand, and the two of them slipped out to the dance floor as a slow song enveloped them. Sounds like a plan to me, Craig said, standing and helping Bridget out of her chair. They followed the first couple to the floor as Lisa sat watching them. She laid her chin in her hand as dreaminess overtook her. Craig and Bridget are nice, she finally said, to fill the void the foursome had left. Yeah. Uneasily, Jeff slid his hands under the table to straighten his pants. A minute, 2, and Lisa's gaze slid from the dance floor to him. I'm glad Dustin and Eve made it. I think they needed a night out. He turned a confused look on her. Why would you say that? She shrugged as trepidation tiptoed across her heart, and her gaze traveled back out. She was pretty worried about him last week. Not that I blame her. He looked pretty bummed. Yeah, he was. Absently, Jeff's finger tapped on the table. I guess it's as hard on the wives as it is on the guys sometimes. Sometimes? Her mind screamed, but she let it slide. Hey, Camden liked the proposal for the new ads, you know, the ones with the displays falling over on the guy? His gaze snapped to hers. No kidding? Sick, twisted sense of humor, she said with a playful shrug. Must be a guy thing. Gee, thanks, he said, and there was a hint of that smile again. Jeff, my man! The voice came from behind Lisa, and she jumped at the sound of it. Dante. She knew it without even looking up. Head bent, she watched the two shake hands. And this is? He put his hand on her back and wound his body around to get a good look at her. Pulling rational to her, Lisa looked at him and forced herself to smile. It is! Lisa! Smoothly, Dante swung the chair next to her around and sat down. Now, you know, I could be wrong about this, but did you or did you not promise me a dance for this evening? If there had been any way out of it, Lisa would have found it, but from where she sat, she could see none. Dante stood and offered her his hand. You don't mind, do you, Jeff? Stricken. It was the best word to describe the look on Jeff's face when Lisa looked to him for an excuse out of this. No, course I don't mind. Twice on her way to the floor, with Dante's arm securely around her waist, she looked back at the table, and the only thing she could think was how incredibly alone Jeff looked, sitting there watching her leave. The middle of her heart twisted at the sight. When they got to the dance floor, Dante took her in his arms, and Lisa pulled herself up straight. Formal. "Don't give an inch. Don't let him think that I'm at all interested." They moved together for a few minutes without so much as looking at each other. Then something in her said it was rude to not even look at the guy. Hesitantly, she glanced up at him and smiled. He caught the gaze and held it. "You know, I have to tell you, Taylor is one lucky guy," Dante said, and although she fully expected him to be smooth and oily, his voice was anything but. Curiously, her head turned as the fear she had felt in his presence prior to this moment slipped away. In his eyes was only softness and sincerity. "I still can't believe he had the guts to make a move on you. I mean, I didn't even have the nerve to do that, although I wanted to." She knew the fear should be creeping up on her. She waited for it, but there wasn't a shred of it anywhere. "Jeff's a pretty good guy, though, so if it couldn't be me, I'm glad it's him," Dante said with a soft smile. Tears sprang to her eyes, although she wasn't exactly sure why. "We gave him a pretty hard time when he first got there," Dante continued, wholly taking over the conversation so she didn't need to so much as nod to keep it going. "But I've got to tell you, that guy is one of the gutsiest people I've ever known." "I think all of you are pretty gutsy," she said, finally corralling her voice. "Not like Taylor. He's a fireman's fireman." Then Dante smiled. "Well, he will be in a few years when he lives down the whole rookie thing. But I've got a lot of respect for him, rookie or not." The song ended, and they stood for one more moment. Then Dante's hold on her broke so that his hand went just to the small of her back. "Better get you back to your boyfriend. He's probably itching to dance with you himself." Lisa smiled as they wound their way through the tables to where Jeff still sat all alone. She slid into the chair next to him as Dante extended his hand. "Thanks, man. You've got quite a woman there." "I know," Jeff said as his gaze landed on her in lock time with his arm, which draped across the back of her chair. With a small wave, Dante disappeared into the crowd. When he was gone, Jeff leaned into her. "Sorry about that." "No," she said softly, still trying to get used to the idea. "Dante's cool." In confusion, Jeff looked at her just as Dustin and Eve stumbled through the tables and collapsed into their chairs. "They really should have this thing in December, when it's less than 90 degrees outside," Eve said, fanning herself theatrically. She picked up the fall of wavy black hair and fanned her neck. "It's not healthy to get this hot." "I don't think outside's the problem," Jeff said with a laugh. "Oh yeah?" Eve shot back as she let her hair go. "How would you know? I haven't seen you out there shaking your booty yet." "And you won't either," Jeff said seriously. Dustin shook his head in exasperation. "Lisa, how in the world did you get stuck with someone so dead set against having fun?" With a long look of love at him, Lisa slid her hand down the length of Jeff's thigh. "I'm not complaining." He looked at her in surprise, and a second later, gratefulness slipped into his eyes. "Ugh," Eve said, still fanning. "You two make me sick." "Why, you jealous?" Jeff asked, although his gaze never left Lisa's face. "Remind me," Eve said to Dustin dramatically. "Isn't that what you always said to him?" "You know, I think you're right," Dustin said with teasing around the edges. "When did he suddenly get all lovey-dovey on us?" "I don't know. I think it had something to do with a bachelorette party, as I recall," Eve said. "And, the way it looks now, we may be headed for another one real soon." That remark slammed Jeff's eyelids down as he laughed. He pulled Lisa's shoulder under his arm and turned to his friends. "You two sure make it hard to be romantic. You know that?" "Romantic?" Eve asked in horror. "Oh my gosh, did that word just come out of your mouth? Lisa, what have you done to our sweet, little, innocent Jeff?" Lisa shook her head as her hand caught his under the table. "It wasn't me. I was just sitting in a booth minding my own business. Now, I know that's a lie, Dustin said, laughing, because Jeff wouldn't know a move if it jumped up and bit him. Jeff settled in next to Lisa as he shook his head. You have such little faith in me. I know you, remember? Dustin asked as the next song started. He sat for 4 beats and then looked across at Lisa. Well, Lisa, since I know Romeo here's not going to ask you, I guess it's up to me. Would you do me the honor? He stood and held out a hand to her. Embarrassment heated its way across her face as she laid her hand in his. Sure. She stood and then looked back at Jeff. You don't mind, do you? He looked first at Lisa and then at Dustin as lightheartedness danced across his face. Would it matter if I did? No, Dustin said, quickly pulling Lisa forward, and she laughed. Yeah, that's what I thought, Jeff called after them as he sank back into his seat. He couldn't be mad. He loved them all too much, and it was too obvious that against every probability, they all liked each other. The music floated around him as his heart filled with gratefulness. Well, if you're not going to ask, then I am, Eve said, suddenly standing. Let's dance. Fear slammed into him as he looked up. Dance? Sure, she said, quickly grabbing his hand. I'd love to. Dustin was a good 6 inches taller than Jeff, and Lisa wondered how Eve's arm didn't go completely numb by the end of the night from laying it on his shoulder. Dancing with him wasn't difficult, though. He had such a commanding presence about him. It wasn't demanding. It was simply powerful in a comforting kind of way. The only one she could think that came close to it was Jeff. But Jeff's version of presence was far less conspicuous than Dustin's. It was only on display for a precious few. I'm sure glad my plans didn't work out, Dustin said, leaning closer to her after they had danced halfway around the floor. Oh, what plans were those? She asked, arching her neck so she could look at him. All those plans to set Jeff up with someone I thought would be perfect for him. Dustin raised his eyebrows in quick succession, causing the good-natured side of her to vault forward. Oh yeah? And just how many someones are we talking about here? Countless, Dustin said with an exasperated sigh. I'd just about given up on that boy. He was so hopeless. Hopeless? It was that bad? Slowly, Dustin's face fell into a pained expression. My cousin thought he had xenophobia or something. Ah, the illustrious cousin. And she wasn't even the worst of them. There was the secretary at Eve's office, and the cute blonde from the fast food place, and Bridget's friend, and my hairdresser. The incredulousness poured over her. He went out with all of them? Well, that depends on your definition of going out. The hairdresser never even got picked up. He chickened out on the way to go get her. Bridget's friend, well, let's just say Catalina salad dressing doesn't exactly go well with black heels and white velvet. He shook his head. Trust me, it wasn't pretty. But they did go out. Once, Dustin said. Then it would have taken a United Nations conference to get either one to so much as talk about the idea again. I thought we were going to have to call in Cyrano de Bergerac before any girl would have a chance to get close enough to decide he was worth a second date. In 2 perfect circles, Dustin spun her before catching her again. But I'm very happy to see that Providence stepped in. Providence, huh? Teasingly, he looked at her. What would you call it? The best thing that ever happened to me, her mind said happily. Oh no, don't look now, Dustin said, turning her so she couldn't see the rest of the dance floor. What? She asked, trying to turn despite his efforts to keep her from looking. I said don't look. This could forever alter your perception of his romantic possibilities. Confused, Lisa yanked Dustin around and surveyed the dance floor until her gaze landed on them. Jeff and Eve moving together, although it couldn't really be called together, and it really couldn't be called dancing either, as he was looking only at his feet, which were not in any kind of sync with the beat or with Eve's. Instantly, protective compassion for him slid over her. My sympathies, Dustin said, glancing down at her. A peaceful sigh whispered from her lungs. I wouldn't want him any other way. Dustin's gaze snapped to her questioningly, and she looked up at him with perfect peace. Otherwise, he wouldn't be Jeff. Understanding flowed over his features as he spun her again with the end of the song. Instead of guiding her back to the table, however, he angled their trajectory over to where Jeff and Eve stood. The first thing Lisa noticed was that not a scintilla of Jeff's stance was at ease, fidgety and awkward, out of place and embarrassed. Those were all much closer. The next song started. Thank you for keeping her warm for me, Dustin said, nudging Lisa next to Jeff as he took Eve's hand. Yeah, no problem, Jeff said, but he never really looked up. See ya, Dustin said, and they danced off. Uneasily, Jeff's gaze followed them even as Lisa's tried not to. However, even trying not to, she caught the silent conversation that passed between the two men, with Dustin shooing Jeff forward, even as Jeff seemed to shrink back. We could go sit down if you want, Lisa said, searching for some way to diffuse the panic permeating Jeff's expression. A moment, and he nodded, and she turned back for the tables. Or we could dance. Her feet stopped, and when she turned back to him, his gaze was on the floor. If you want, he said, as his eyes slipped up to meet hers. A soft smile accompanied her silent nod. Slowly, she stepped over to him, and when her arm slipped up to his shoulder, she couldn't help but feel how perfectly they fit together. Forever, she could dance with him, and her arm would never go to sleep. The first sideways step wasn't smooth, but neither of them tripped either. The second one to the other side was better, hesitant, but better. By the third, her mind had stopped worrying about her feet and had started tracing the track of the points of his body that were touching hers. Arm under arm, his supported hers like a breath. On her back, the web of his hand pressed firmly, holding her, guiding her, solid and safe. The lights winked around them as after several steps, he turned her other hand around to hold it to his chest. Funny how much more natural that felt. As she swayed, the appreciation that she wasn't dancing to show off to anyone slid over her. This wasn't about anyone other than the two of them. When she glanced at him, her heart slammed to a stop when she found him gazing at her. He didn't have to say a thing, only to smile, and any doubts she had left melted into the strength of him. Slowly, her hand slid forward, dropping over the solid muscle of his neck and chest, so that when it stopped, only her elbow was still on his shoulder. His chest, strong and true, called her to it, and softly she laid her cheek on the scratchy black material. It gave new meaning to breathing, for simultaneously she felt energized and completely lightheaded, drifting on the fragrance of his cologne. She hadn't noticed it before. How it had escaped her, she couldn't quite tell, because the part of her in charge of deciphering little things, like how she had even gotten to this point, seemed no longer to be in service. The only thing she could feel, the only thing she ever wanted to feel again, was him holding her, swaying to a beat that she didn't even hear. In her ears rang only the faint sound of his heartbeat far beneath the layers, blending with hers in a harmony so perfect it should have been reserved for heaven itself. How long they had been dancing, Jeff wasn't really sure. It seemed like forever, and yet it seemed like mere seconds. Holding her, moving with her, had nothing to do with where his feet were or where his hands were supposed to be. She was here, in his arms. Everything else was academic. Hey, you two, Dustin said, his voice breaking through the knot of contentment that had settled over them. Blearily, they pulled apart, but never really let go of one another. We're going to take off. Jeff's movement slowed to a halt. He knew that Dustin never left a party early, and his leaving could only mean that the time for them to leave as well was upon them. Already? Already? It's after 1, Dustin said with a check of his watch. I've got work tomorrow. Oh, yeah, of course. Still caught in the haze of her, Jeff extended his hand. "Take care out there." "Yeah, you too," Dustin said with a smile that said that comment didn't just mean work. "Call me." Jeff nodded, and his friends stepped away from them. Regretting that he had to, he looked at Lisa, who was more beautiful now than she had been 7 hours before. Well, I guess it's time to call it a night. For a second, he wasn't sure she had even heard the comment. Then a gentle pleading look traced through her eyes. One more dance? Like 1,000 racehorses at the gun, his heart leaped forward as he smiled. "But I don't dance." Her smile held no irony. "I know." Once again, she was in his arms, and his only wish was that she would be forever. At her apartment door, Lisa wondered when she had stumbled into this unbelievable dream. Life swirled around her, arching in no definite patterns so that she felt like she might fall right off of it at any moment. The one and only thing keeping her upright was his arm, tucked securely around her waist, holding her lest she fall. "So, you going to be hungry tomorrow night?" he asked softly as his other arm slid around her to join its partner at her back. His heartbeat drifted over her again. "Yeah, and the next night, and the next night, and the night after that," she said, floating away on the words as his lips found hers. It was by far the most amazing moment she had ever occupied. "I tried to call you last night," Dustin said when they were 6 sentences into the conversation on Tuesday afternoon. "What'd you do, go AWOL on me?" In a heap, Jeff sat down on the couch and propped his feet on the coffee table. "No, I was at Lisa's trying to find a way to make office supplies sound interesting." "Office supplies?" "Yeah, she got a new account on Monday. She was kind of freaking out." "Only about Monday?" Dustin asked. One foot slipped off and the other followed as Jeff sat up. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dustin laughed softly. "Like you don't know. Oh, by the way, Eve's wondering if we should plan on a winter wedding or late summer. She needs some new shoes." "Ha ha." "No, I don't think she was kidding." Jeff shook his head. It never ended. They were never satisfied. "Well, I think she's going to have to ask someone other than me." "Oh, who's that?" "I don't know. Whoever decided I could handle all this in the first place." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Lisa is so great, and I'm so hopeless." "Thank you very much." "You're welcome," Dustin said with no trace of laughter. "But listen, I've got to be honest with you. I really don't think she cares how hopeless you are." "Well, I don't know why not." The statement vaulted Jeff off the couch, and he took 2 steps one way and reversed course. "Every other one has." "Okay," Dustin said slowly. "Maybe you haven't noticed this, but she's not like every other one." "But why not? What makes her so different?" Jeff asked in frustration as he collapsed onto a bar stool. "Well, for one thing, she's in love with you." "In love?" The words smashed through him as his head snapped up. "Oh, I don't—" "And you're in love with her," Dustin continued gently. "Trust me on this one, Jeffrey. When that gets right, everything else is moot." There was a pause as Dustin let that sink in, and Jeff frantically searched for a way to refute it. "So, have you told your mom about her yet?" That question exploded through the middle of all the others as Jeff closed his eyes to squeeze it out. "No." "Why not?" There were 10,000 why nots lined up at the mere question. "Well, for one thing, I haven't talked to her since November." "She'd want to know," Dustin said. "She still cares about you, Jeff. She wouldn't have come that day if she didn't." Slowly, Jeff sighed. "I wouldn't even know what to say to her anymore. Not that I ever did." "So your solution is to not say anything at all?" "Yes," screamed through him. "Definitely yes. Life would be much safer that way." "She doesn't want to hear from me. I can't put her through that again." "And one day when a building does fall on you, and you're taken away too, You think she won't hurt just the same?" The top of the counter pulled Jeff's head down to it, and he knocked it 3 times on the hard formica. I don't know what to do. Whether you believe it or not, you deserve to have her in your life. Maybe this time she'll come around." His hand pressed hard against his forehead, pushing to get the very thought out of his head. And what if you're wrong? A pause, and only that. What if I'm not? This has been To Protect and Serve, Volume 1 of the Courage series. Written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings. This has been a Braveheart Audiobooks production.
You don't want to miss what comes next. Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.